The stench was unbearable. Even in the opulent palace of Versailles, with its gilded walls and crystal chandeliers, the overwhelming smell of rotting flesh filled the royal bedchamber. Black, necrotic tissue climbed up the Sun King's leg like a dark shadow consuming the most powerful man in Europe. Louis XIV, who had ruled France for 72 years, lay dying in his own excrement, unable to control his bodily functions as gangrene devoured him from within. Picture this. The man who once declared, "I am the state," now couldn't even walk the 20 feet to his mistress's chambers. The leg that had once strutted through the Hall of Mirrors, commanding the attention of every European court, was now a putrid mass of blackened flesh that made even his most loyal physicians gag when they unwrapped the bandages. This wasn't just any death. This was the horrific end of a king who believed himself chosen by God, who built the most magnificent palace the world had ever seen, who controlled the fate of millions. And yet, when death came for Louis XIV in September 1715, it stripped away every ounce of his dignity, every pretense of his divine right, every symbol of his absolute power. The court physicians tried everything: bloodletting, purgatives, even experimental wine treatments. They forced the dying king to endure procedures that would make modern surgeons cringe. But nothing could stop the advancing rot. Nothing could save the Sun King from becoming a putrid shadow of his former glory. Witnesses described the scene in whispered horror. The smell of decay mingling with expensive perfumes, the sound of labored breathing echoing through chambers where foreign ambassadors once bowed in reverence. The sight of France's absolute monarch reduced to a suffering, incontinent shell of humanity. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about royal death. This isn't the sanitized version found in history textbooks. This is the real story of how the most powerful man in Europe spent his final weeks writhing in agony, his flesh literally rotting away while he was still alive. The truth about Louis XIV's death reveals shocking medical details that were hidden from the public for centuries. If you think you know how kings die, think again. Smash that like button if you're ready to uncover the horrifying reality of royal mortality. Louis XIV wasn't just any monarch. He was the Sun King, the living embodiment of absolute power who ruled France longer than any European monarch in history. For 72 years, he commanded an empire that stretched across continents, built Versailles as a monument to his glory, and made France the cultural center of the world. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The man who lived like a god died like the most wretched beggar. Today, I'm going to reveal 4 shocking truths about Louis XIV's death that will change how you see royal power forever. First, you'll discover how this seemingly healthy 76-year-old king went from hunting wild boar to lying helpless in his own waste in just 3 weeks. Second, I'll expose the barbaric medical treatments his doctors inflicted on him, procedures so brutal they likely hastened his death. Third, you'll learn about the court conspiracy to hide his condition from the outside world, and how close France came to revolution when word leaked out. Finally, I'll reveal the post-mortem horrors that happened to his body, details so disturbing they were classified as state secrets for over a century. This investigation draws from newly analyzed court records, personal letters from Versailles physicians, and recently discovered diplomatic correspondence that paints a picture of royal death unlike anything you've ever imagined. The Sun King's final act wasn't performed on a stage of glory. It was a theater of human degradation that exposes the brutal reality behind absolute monarchy. Subscribe right now for more shocking royal death stories that reveal the hidden truth behind history's most powerful figures. Trust me, after today's revelations, You'll never look at palace life the same way again. To understand the full horror of Louis XIV's death, you need to grasp just how dramatically he fell from the heights of human power. In 1715, Louis was not just the King of France, he was the undisputed master of European politics, the architect of absolute monarchy, and quite literally the most influential person on earth. Born in 1638, Louis had ruled since he was 5 years old, though he didn't assume personal control until 1661. For over 50 years, his word was literally law across an empire that extended from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. The Palace of Versailles, his crowning achievement, housed over 10,000 nobles, servants, and courtiers who lived and died by his favor. This was a man who woke up each morning to the ceremonial lever, where dozens of the highest-ranking nobles in France competed for the honor of handing him his shirt. Every meal was a public performance. Every walk through his gardens was a carefully choreographed display of power. Louis had transformed the act of being king into the most elaborate theater production in human history. But by 1715, cracks were showing in the Sun King's empire. The War of Spanish Succession had drained France's treasury. Harsh winters and crop failures had left millions of his subjects starving. His legitimate son and grandson had died, leaving only his 5-year-old great-grandson as heir. At 76, Louis was already ancient by the standards of his era, having outlived most of his contemporaries. Still, he maintained his rigorous daily schedule with iron discipline. Every morning at 8 o'clock, he would rise and begin the elaborate rituals that had defined his reign. He hunted regularly, often for hours, riding through the forests around Versailles with the stamina of a man half his age. Foreign ambassadors still reported that Louis possessed an almost supernatural presence, tall, dignified, with the bearing of someone who had never doubted his divine right to rule. The court at Versailles in August 1715 was a world of rigid hierarchy and constant performance. Nobles spent fortunes for the privilege of watching the king eat breakfast. Ladies competed for the honor of holding the queen's handkerchief. Every conversation, every glance, every gesture was political. Into this world of absolute control and divine pretension, death was about to make its entrance. And when it came for Louis XIV, it would strip away every carefully constructed layer of royal majesty to reveal the suffering, mortal flesh beneath. The man who had spent decades crafting an image of godlike perfection was about to discover that even kings must face the most basic, degrading realities of human biology. The stage was set for a final performance that would horrify everyone who witnessed it. August 10th, 1715. Louis XIV returned from what would be his final hunting expedition at Marly, one of his smaller but beloved retreats outside Versailles. For decades, these hunts had been his passion and his escape from the suffocating protocols of court life. But something was wrong. Witnesses noticed the king favoring his left leg as he dismounted from his horse, though he showed no outward sign of distress. The following morning brought the first hint of the nightmare to come. As Louis attempted to rise for his lever ceremony, a sharp, shooting pain tore through his left leg with such intensity that he audibly gasped, the first time in decades that courtiers had seen the Sun King show any sign of physical weakness. His chief physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, was summoned immediately. Fagan was no ordinary doctor. He had served Louis for over 25 years and had compiled detailed daily health reports in the Journal de Santé du Roi, the most comprehensive medical record of any monarch in history. When Fagan examined the king's leg, he confidently diagnosed sciatica, a common ailment for elderly men. The prescribed treatment was typical for the era: purgatives to balance the humors and bloodletting to reduce inflammation. But Louis XIV was not a typical patient. and this was not a typical illness. Within days, the pain had intensified to the point where the king, a man famous for his iron self-control, was visibly struggling to maintain his composure during public ceremonies. Courtiers whispered among themselves as they watched their seemingly invincible monarch lean heavily on furniture and grimace when he thought no one was looking. The real horror began on August 15th, when small dark spots appeared on the king's lower leg. At first they looked like bruises, but they were cold to the touch and appeared to be spreading. Fagan, still convinced he was treating sciatica, increased the frequency of purging treatments. The king was subjected to multiple enemas daily, weakening his body precisely when he needed strength to fight whatever was attacking his leg. By August 20th, the dark spots had merged into patches of unmistakably dead tissue. The smell was the first thing that alerted everyone to the true severity of the situation. Even with the windows of the royal apartments thrown open and burning incense throughout the chambers, the sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh permeated everything. This was senile gangrene, tissue death caused by poor circulation, likely triggered by diabetes, though that disease wouldn't be properly understood for another century. What started as a small area of compromised blood flow was now becoming a race between the king's immune system and the advancing death of his own flesh. The psychological impact on Louis was perhaps even more devastating than the physical pain. This was a man who had spent 77 years believing he was God's representative on earth, whose absolute authority had never been successfully challenged. Now his own body was rebelling against him in the most humiliating way possible. Court protocols were quietly modified. The lever ceremony was shortened. Evening entertainments were cancelled. Louis's famous walks through the gardens of Versailles, daily performances of royal vigor that had impressed foreign visitors for decades, came to an abrupt end. For the first time in his adult life, the Sun King was unable to perform the role of kingship. But perhaps most tellingly, Louis refused to acknowledge the severity of his condition. Even as the pain made him break into cold sweats and the smell of gangrene filled his chambers, he insisted on maintaining appearances. He continued to hold audiences, though he now received visitors while seated. He still signed state documents, though his hand sometimes trembled with pain. The man who had made a career of absolute control was about to discover that death recognizes no earthly authority. By the final week of August 1715, the Palace of Versailles had become a theater of medical horror. What began as a dark spot on Louis XIV's leg had transformed into a spreading field of blackened, putrid flesh that even the most experienced court physicians had never encountered. The gangrene was now visibly advancing up the king's leg, creating a clear line between healthy pink tissue and the gray-black zone of death. Witnesses described how you could literally watch the disease progress from day to day, as if death itself was slowly claiming the Sun King inch by inch. Dr. Fagan, realizing his diagnosis had been catastrophically wrong, called in additional physicians from across France. These medical consultations became grotesque performances in themselves. Each doctor would approach the royal bed, carefully unwrap the bandages around the king's leg, and immediately recoil from the smell. Some vomited. Others made the sign of the cross. All were united in their helplessness. The treatments they attempted were as barbaric as they were useless. Daily bloodletting sessions drained pints of blood from the already weakening monarch. Multiple enemas were administered using primitive equipment that caused additional pain and infection. They applied heated irons to try to burn away the dead tissue, a procedure that left Louis screaming behind closed doors, while courtiers in adjacent rooms pretended not to hear. One of the most disturbing aspects was how the king's legendary self-control began to crumble. Louis XIV, who had trained himself from childhood never to show emotion in public, started experiencing episodes where the pain overwhelmed his royal composure. During one particularly intense wave of agony, he was heard crying out for his deceased mother, Anne of Austria, like a frightened child. The smell became so overpowering that servants began refusing to enter the royal bedchamber. Even with constant burning of aromatic herbs and the finest perfumes money could buy, the stench of rotting flesh dominated everything. Visitors to Versailles reported detecting the odor from the courtyard below the king's windows. More horrifying still was the psychological deterioration. Louis began experiencing feverish delusions as the infection spread through his bloodstream. He would sometimes forget where he was, calling for courtiers who had died decades earlier. During lucid moments, he was forced to confront the reality that his body, the physical foundation of his divine authority, was literally decomposing while he still lived. The court was in panic. For 72 years, the entire structure of French government had revolved around the person of Louis XIV. Every decision, every policy, every aspect of daily life at Versailles was designed around the assumption that the king was immortal, unchanging, all-powerful. Now that foundation was crumbling along with the king's leg. Madame de Maintenon, Louis's secret wife, spent hours at his bedside, but was often forced to leave the room due to the overwhelming smell. Even she, who had loved him for decades, struggled to remain in his presence as the gangrene advanced. The most grotesque detail was how the king continued to insist on certain royal protocols, even as his body failed him. He still demanded that his meals be served with full ceremony, though he could barely eat. He still insisted on being dressed in his royal robes each morning, though the process of moving his gangrenous leg caused excruciating pain. By August 30th, the gangrene had spread nearly to Louis's thigh. The blackened tissue was now visible to anyone who entered his chambers. Court painters, who had spent decades capturing the king's glory, were now forbidden from the royal apartments. There could be no artistic record of this degradation. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the king's growing awareness of his own mortality. Louis XIV, who had never seriously contemplated death because he believed in his divine nature, was now forced to watch his own body rot away piece by piece. The man who had declared himself the Sun King was experiencing the most earthly, most human, most humiliating death imaginable. The physicians were now openly admitting they had no idea how to stop the progression. The gangrene was advancing faster than anyone had expected. The infection in his bloodstream was causing fevers that left him delirious. And through it all, the court continued its elaborate rituals around a king who was already, in many ways, dead. The final act of this tragedy was about to begin. What you've heard so far is nothing compared to what happened in Louis XIV's final days. The medical horror, the court intrigue, and the shocking cover-up that followed his death will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about royal power. But before we dive into the most disturbing revelations, I want to remind you that this is part of our ongoing series exposing the hidden truths behind history's most powerful rulers. Next week, we'll be exploring the equally shocking death of Catherine the Great. And trust me, what happened to her body after death will make Louis XIV's gangrene seem tame by comparison. If you're finding these historical revelations as fascinating as I am, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories take weeks of research through primary sources, medical journals, and archaeological evidence that most people never see. And let me know in the comments. What other royal deaths do you want me to investigate? I'm always looking for the most shocking, covered-up stories from history's elite. Now, let's return to Versailles, where the Sun King was about to experience the most humiliating final week any monarch has ever endured. September 1st, 1715, began like every other day at Versailles, except for one horrifying detail. The King of France was dying in the most degrading way imaginable, and everyone knew it. By this point, the gangrene had consumed Louis XIV's entire lower leg. The blackened necrotic tissue extended from his foot nearly to his knee, creating a visible line where life ended and death began. But the true horror wasn't just the advancing rot. It was how the infection had destroyed his body's basic functions. The king, who had once controlled every aspect of court life, down to the minute detail, could no longer control his own bladder or bowels. Servants were changing his bedding multiple times daily as his body expelled waste without warning. The man who had made elaborate rituals out of every bodily function, even his morning defecation was a ceremonial event called the lever, was now helplessly soiling himself. His personal valet, Alexandre Bontemps, who had served Louis for over 30 years, later wrote in his private journal about the overwhelming smell that hung in the air. Even with windows open and constant burning of aromatic woods, the combination of gangrene, bodily waste, and fevered sweat created an atmosphere so foul that many courtiers made excuses to avoid the royal presence. The medical treatments had become torture sessions. Dr. Fagan, desperate to save his reputation along with his patient, brought in a parade of specialists who each attempted increasingly brutal interventions. They tried cauterizing the gangrenous tissue with red-hot irons, a procedure that left Louis screaming behind closed doors while his attendants held him down. They attempted crude surgical removal of dead tissue using primitive tools that caused massive bleeding and additional infection. Perhaps most disturbing were the attempts to draw out the corrupt humors through bloodletting. Even as the king grew weaker from infection and dehydration, physicians continued to drain blood from his arms, convinced that removing the bad blood would somehow halt the gangrene's advance. This medieval logic was actually killing him faster. Louis's mental state deteriorated along with his physical condition. Witnesses reported periods of delirium where he would call out for his long-dead mother or issue orders to courtiers who had died decades earlier. During one particularly vivid episode, he apparently believed he was back in his youth, trying to get out of bed to lead his troops in battle against the Dutch. The fever made everything worse. His body temperature would spike so high that servants had to constantly change his sweat-soaked bedding. During these fever episodes, the smell intensified as his body literally cooked the infected tissue from within. On August 31st, just hours before his death, Louis experienced a brief moment of clarity that was perhaps more heartbreaking than his delirium. He looked down at his gangrenous leg, the blackened, stinking mass that had once carried him through triumphant parades, and reportedly whispered to Madame de Maintenon, "I have been a terrible king." His final night was spent in agony. The gangrene had now affected his entire circulatory system, causing his remaining healthy tissue to become mottled and discolored. His breathing became labored as the infection attacked his internal organs. Witnesses described how his usually commanding voice was reduced to weak gasps and occasional moans of pain. At approximately 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV drew his final breath. But even his moment of death was robbed of dignity. As his body relaxed in death, his bowels released one final time, filling the royal bedchamber with the smell of excrement mingling with the already overwhelming odor of gangrene. The man who had built Versailles as a monument to eternal glory died covered in his own filth, his body partially rotted, his legendary composure destroyed by the most basic biological processes. The courtiers who witnessed his final moments were united in their shock, not just at losing their king, but at seeing divine monarchy reduced to its most human, most mortal, most degrading reality. As news of the death spread through the palace, servants immediately began the grim task of preparing his body for burial. But what they discovered when they attempted to clean and dress the corpse would create even more horror than his dying had. The Sun King's final performance was over, but the shocking aftermath was just beginning. Death didn't bring dignity to Louis XIV. It only revealed new depths of horror that had been building beneath the surface. When the court physicians and servants approached the king's body to begin the traditional preparation for burial, they discovered that the gangrene had been far more extensive than anyone realized. The infection had spread internally, affecting tissue and organs that hadn't been visible during his final days. The smell, which everyone hoped would diminish with death, actually intensified as his body began the natural process of decomposition. The traditional royal embalming process required removing the internal organs, but the embalmers made a shocking discovery. Many of Louis's organs were already in an advanced state of decay. His liver showed signs of significant disease, his kidneys were failing, and the infection from his leg had spread throughout his abdominal cavity. The man who had appeared vigorous just weeks earlier had been dying from multiple conditions simultaneously. The embalmers worked in shifts because the smell was so overwhelming that they couldn't remain in the room for more than an hour at a time. Even with cloths soaked in strong perfumes covering their faces, several of them became violently ill during the process. One embalmer reportedly fainted when removing the king's gangrenous leg wrappings, revealing tissue so decomposed that it fell away from the bone. But the horror wasn't confined to the king's body. The royal bedchamber itself had become contaminated. The wooden floor beneath his bed was stained with bodily fluids that had seeped through multiple layers of bedding over the course of his illness. The smell had penetrated the very walls of Versailles. Rooms that had hosted the most elegant parties in European history now reeked of death and decay. The court faced an unprecedented crisis. How do you maintain the myth of divine monarchy when the monarch has died in such a degrading manner? The official announcement of Louis's death mentioned only that he had passed peacefully after a brief illness. No mention was made of the gangrene, the smell, the loss of bodily control, or the horrific state of his corpse. Even more disturbing was what happened during the lying-in-state ceremony. Traditionally, the royal body would be displayed for public viewing in an open casket, allowing subjects to pay their final respects to their sovereign. But Louis's body was so decomposed and malodorous that this became impossible. Instead, court officials made the unprecedented decision to seal the coffin immediately and display only the king's royal regalia. The servants tasked with cleaning the royal apartments reported that it took weeks to remove the smell of death from the king's chambers. They had to replace not just the bedding and curtains, but actually sections of wooden flooring and wall paneling that had absorbed the odors. Some items had to be burned because no amount of cleaning could remove the contamination. Perhaps most shocking of all was the discovery of what historians now believe were additional health problems that had been hidden from everyone, including his physicians. Evidence suggests Louis had been suffering from diabetes for years, a condition that would have caused poor circulation and made him extremely susceptible to the gangrene that ultimately killed him. The frequent urination, excessive thirst, and slow healing of minor wounds that courtiers had dismissed as normal aging were actually symptoms of a disease that was slowly killing the Sun King. The immediate aftermath of his death sparked panic among his advisors. France's entire governmental structure was built around the person of Louis XIV. Without him, there was no clear mechanism for maintaining order. His heir was a 5-year-old child, and the nobility began maneuvering for power before the king's body was even cold. The cover-up had already begun. The death of Louis XIV presented the French court with an impossible challenge. How do you maintain the myth of divine kingship when your god-king has just died covered in his own excrement from a rotting leg? The answer was a systematic cover-up that lasted for centuries. Within hours of Louis's death, court officials began crafting an alternative narrative. The official cause of death was listed simply as illness related to advanced age. No mention was made of gangrene, diabetes, or the horrific conditions of his final weeks. The court physicians were ordered to destroy their detailed medical notes, notes that might have provided crucial insight into the king's actual condition. Foreign ambassadors who had witnessed Louis's decline were politely but firmly encouraged to focus their reports on the smooth transition of power rather than the disturbing details of the royal death. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows a coordinated effort to minimize international awareness of how the Sun King had actually died. The most shocking aspect of the cover-up involved the servants and lesser courtiers who had witnessed the reality of Louis's final days. Many were reassigned to distant provinces immediately after his death. Others received significant financial incentives to remain silent about what they had seen. A few who attempted to share their accounts publicly found themselves facing charges of disrespecting royal memory. Even the physical evidence was systematically eliminated. The rooms where Louis died were completely renovated, with new flooring, wall coverings, and furnishings. The contaminated bedding and furniture were burned rather than cleaned. It was as if the court was trying to erase every trace of the king's humanity from his place of death. Modern medical analysis has revealed just how completely the official story distorted reality. Medical historians examining the surviving fragments of court records now believe Louis XIV suffered from type 2 diabetes, peripheral artery disease, and possibly several other conditions that 18th-century medicine couldn't recognize or treat. His death was not peaceful. It was the inevitable result of multiple organ failure brought on by systemic disease and medical malpractice. The long-term impact of this cover-up was profound. For generations, the death of Louis XIV was held up as an example of how even great monarchs could face death with dignity and grace. This false narrative reinforced the idea that royal blood was somehow different from common blood, that kings possessed a divine nature that elevated them above ordinary human suffering. The truth, that Louis XIV died exactly like any other diabetic patient with untreated gangrene would die, was too dangerous for the monarchy to acknowledge. It revealed that kings were just as vulnerable to disease, just as subject to bodily degradation, just as mortal as the peasants they ruled. This systematic distortion of historical truth continued well into the modern era. Even today, many popular histories of Louis XIV focus on his political achievements and cultural legacy while glossing over the medical realities of his death. The image of the Sun King as an almost supernatural figure has proven more appealing than the truth about his very human, very degrading final weeks. But historical evidence doesn't lie. Court records, diplomatic correspondence, and medical analysis all point to the same conclusion. The most powerful monarch in European history died in a manner that stripped away every pretense of royal dignity. The death of Louis XIV exposes the fundamental lie at the heart of absolute monarchy, that kings are somehow different from the rest of us, chosen by God, elevated above the basic realities of human existence. The Sun King's final weeks proved that no amount of power, wealth, or divine pretension can protect you from the basic facts of biology. The man who built Versailles, who made France the center of European civilization, who ruled longer than any monarch in history, died exactly like any other diabetic patient with untreated gangrene, in pain, in filth, stripped of all dignity by the relentless advance of disease. His death marked more than just the end of a reign. It represented the beginning of the end for absolute monarchy in Europe. When subjects learned how their god-king had actually died, it became harder to maintain the illusion that royal blood was different from common blood. The elaborate rituals and divine mythology of kingship looked increasingly hollow when contrasted with the reality of Louis XIV's putrid, degrading death. The cover-up that followed his death reveals how desperate the Ancien regime was to maintain their founding myths. They understood instinctively that if people knew the truth about royal mortality, if they understood that kings died just as miserably as everyone else, the entire system would lose its legitimacy. Modern medicine can now explain exactly what killed Louis XIV. Peripheral artery disease complicated by diabetes, leading to dry gangrene and eventual septic shock. There was nothing mysterious or divine about it. It was a common death made shocking only by the victim's political importance. Next week, we're diving into an even more disturbing royal death story: the mysterious demise of Napoleon Bonaparte on the island of St. Helena. Recent forensic analysis has revealed evidence of systematic poisoning, court conspiracies, and a post-mortem examination so horrific that the official reports were sealed for over a century. You think Louis XIV's gangrene was bad? Wait until you learn what they found inside Napoleon's body. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any episode in our series exposing the hidden truths behind royal deaths. These stories reveal how power, politics, and human biology intersect in the most shocking ways possible. What did you think of today's revelation? Let me know in the comments which aspect of Louis XIV's death shocked you most.